Good afternoon and welcome to Virtual Face to Face. I'm Alex Lakowski, Assistant Vice President of Communications. Affirmative action is the most important anti-discrimination technique ever instituted in the United States. Affirmative action, by all statistical measures, has been the central ingredient to the creation of the black middle class. Those words from Congresswoman and former EEOC Chair Eleanor Holmes Norton appeared in Essence magazine a little more than 30 years ago. The facts haven't changed much, but our use of affirmative action, particularly in higher education, has changed. Race does matter in college admissions, at least for the moment, as we wait for decisions in two cases before the U.S. Supreme Court that could change everything. Now, race is often used as one consideration in college admissions for this simple reason. Race can often provide insight into a person's life experiences, the challenges they face and overcome, what they bring to the table for the benefit of everyone else at the university. Resilience, creativity, empathy, for instance, might be more important qualities than having the highest MCAT scores when it comes to being an effective physician. So race-conscious admissions evolved from true affirmative action as it was labeled in the 1960s. The original idea, of course, was to use policies to level the playing field to help overcome centuries of terrible injustice and barriers to education and jobs for those disadvantaged because of their race, gender, religion, and national origin. Greatest number at that time, of course, being African Americans and women. And if you think giving preferences to a select group based only on their race, sex, or ethnicity sounds like a terrible idea, you're right. But of course, the world we live in has given preference to one group. Lots of preference in every aspect of life in our society, and in many ways still does. Now, in 1978, the Supreme Court outlawed quotas in the Bakke ruling, but the court did find a compelling state interest in the benefits of diversity and allowed race to be considered in college admissions in some cases. 25 years later, the court reaffirmed mostly Bakke in the 2003 Grutter case, but it did strike down points-based systems and required universities to consider applicants individually and more holistically. The cases before the justices now, which could be decided any day, could even be today, involve the University of North Carolina, a public university, and Harvard University, of course, private. Both cases are brought by the same group, Students for Fair Admissions. They're a little bit different, but the plaintiffs allege in the Harvard case that Harvard did impose a quota, a limit on the number of Asian students admitted despite often superior academic performance. So Harvard denies that, saying a large majority of the 40,000 applicants it receives for just 2,000 spots are highly qualified, all of them. So it applies other criteria as well, such as essays and personal references. During oral arguments last October, there were quite a few questions about an end point for considerations of race. Chief Justice John Roberts also pointedly stated that if universities were not allowed to consider race when recruiting diverse student bodies, then maybe there will be an incentive for the university to, in fact, he said, truly pursue race-neutral alternatives. Well, we already do have some idea of what the impact might be on higher ed if the court bans the use of race in any way from college admissions. That's because 10 states already do that. California did it in 1996 with Proposition 209. And right away, enrollment of students from underrepresented minority groups dropped 12% system-wide. And at prestigious Berkeley and UCLA, it dropped by about 60%. By 2006, there were just 96 black freshmen at UCLA. Same thing at the University of Michigan. Following that state's ban in 2006, black student enrollment dropped from 7% to a little over 4% today. And what happened to those students who didn't get into UCLA and Michigan? Well, you can bet they were accepted at less prestigious institutions in the system, creating an even more competitive environment there. So there are other issues at play. Now, President Bill Clinton said in 1995 that affirmative action should not go on forever. It should be retired, he said, when its job is done. But the numbers show the job isn't done. It's estimated that in 2036, just 13 years from now, half of U.S. high school graduates will be people of color. But a 2022 McKinsey study showed that at the rate the country is going, it'll take 70 years for American higher ed enrollments to reach parity with their state's populations of underrepresented minority students. So, what are we going to do? Well, the good news is that we're already doing quite a bit to create a more diverse and inclusive campus. We're doing a pretty good job. And a good many great minds, maybe yours too, are coming up with new strategies to help us get there. Joining us with an update on the state of things and to help sort through the possibilities are Chief Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer and Vice President Diane Forbes-Berthoud, and Patricia Scott, Assistant Vice President for Enrollment Administration and University Registrar. Your thoughts, ideas, and questions are also critical to this discussion. Please send me a chat whenever you want. And don't wait. We'll try to get everyone's voice heard, but if you want to remain anonymous, that's fine. Just let me know that. So Diane, before we go any farther, maybe we should just start out by reminding everyone why having a diverse student body is so important for everyone at UMB in the first place.
Thank you, Alex. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, panelists, and thanks for joining us today. So, a simple way that I would put it, Alex, is a diverse environment makes us better. How so? So one of the ways I think about it is the ways in which the teaching and learning environment is improved and enhanced. When students and educators, learners are in an environment that's diverse, it contributes to improved critical thinking, increased collaboration, enhanced problem solving, and believe it or not, there are better health outcomes. It's a less stressful or less isolating environment. People feel like they belong. And so just looking at the research, increased student diversity often impacts retention and belonging for students, particularly those who are underrepresented. And students are better prepared by being in a diverse environment, learning diverse topics in the curriculum, interacting with diverse backgrounds, people, cultures. One very interesting finding is that underrepresented and minoritized medical students rank patient population, gender diversity, and ethnic diversity higher than non-URM students as selected what some of the criteria they'd use for selecting their residency programs. So it also is going to improve the health and human services environment as well as the patients and the clients with whom students work. So think about it. I mean, you have a given topic and we're learning about pollution or we're learning about access or health inequity, hearing from people from different perspectives, different parts of the country, different identities or backgrounds, as well as reading research from different areas enriches our understanding of that particular phenomenon. So overall, it enriches the teaching and learning environment and we learn and grow in ways that benefit all of us.
Well, it's funny, very directly, Dr. Perman used to say all the time that we're generating the next generation of professionals, healthcare, social services, legal professionals, and that the people that they interact with very often will respond better and prefer and be more comfortable with people who have some of the same background, maybe look like them. And so that can be important when we talk about dealing with health disparities in communities right here in Baltimore and really everywhere. So that's another important thing to think about pertains to our mission.
Absolutely. And we see this especially as it relates to race and also gender. And in some cases, socioeconomic status. So clients or patients are more inclined, as you shared, to not only self-disclose, but trust their provider a little bit more if there is closer, what we call concordance or similarity in identities, particularly on race, gender, or cultural lines. I appreciate that physicians and other providers put the languages they speak, as well as a rainbow or pride flag to show that, there's allegiance here. You can be comfortable with me. I speak your language. I treat patients from the LGBT population or I understand your sets of experiences. So those markers are really important because it shows that it improves health outcomes and people are more likely to seek care and improve the relationship as well with their providers.
It was really exciting before the program we were talking, and Patricia, you shared a great statistic about, I didn't know how we're doing. So why don't you talk about how UMB is doing when it comes to creating a diverse and inclusive student body?
Yes, Alex and Diane, and thank you for having me to share with this. When I looked at the numbers, because at first it was going to be anecdotal from what I see, but when I looked at our spring enrollment, spring of 2023, UMB had enrolled 6,721 students. Of those 6,721 students, 3,239 students identified as either American Indian, Asian, Black, Hispanic, multiple races, or Pacific Islander. So that gives UMB a 48% of our enrollment are students from a diverse background. So is UMB doing a great job? I would say yes.
Right, but now we get students from undergraduate institutions all over the place, especially in Maryland. Is there a concern that pipeline can be impacted potentially by this decision if at those schools they can't consider a person's race as just one factor in admissions?
don't really think that that's going to impact UMB because, as you indicated, we do admit students from all over, even internationally, we admit students. And because of the strength of the programs that UMB has, a student who's looking for a top criminal law or clinical law program, they're going to come to UMB. For someone who's looking for opportunities in clinical social work, doing field placements, they're going to come here. Our nursing programs are highly ranked, pharmacy. And again, when we look at the care that our dental students get to provide to those in West Baltimore and beyond, I think UMB is going to not see an impact should race no longer be a factor during undergraduate schools admitting students.
Jan, I know when we were talking about doing this program in the first place, one of your goals was to let people know what we're doing, what we've been successful in many ways. Why is that? What are we doing right?
What the university is doing right
Yeah,
to enhance diversity and
how are we doing that?
so a few things that are really important, led by my office in partnership with a number of offices across campus, is learning more about the state of equity, diversity, and inclusion at UMB. And one of the ways we're doing that is to continue to build our assessment infrastructure, if you will. So in the past year, we've administered staff experience surveys, faculty experience survey, and last year, the student experience survey. And it's not only to, hey, people, fill this out, but it's to learn about what's working, what's not working so well for various populations, and then to institute or build on programs that have already been built. We have a number of training and development programs, pipeline and pathway programs, and doing more related to faculty development and diversity. Recently, we've established a faculty of color network, and other affinity groups are being sponsored and built. These things matter because it increases a sense of belonging and increases our retention and experience at the university for faculty, for staff, and for students, which leads to success, academic success, professional success. And of course, we have programs like the Emerge and the PULP program that has a diverse representation of faculty, staff, students, and administrators in the various programs offered. So we continue to work partnering with Human Resources, the Intercultural Center, Faculty Affairs, Office of the Provost to look at areas that we need to improve, and we're building bit by bit.
Yeah. Now, you, of course, I talked about the University of California system, 1996. You were in that system for a while. You saw what it did to the enrollment there, and some of the maybe had to have an idea of some of the measures they took to deal with that. Talk about that. What was that experience like, and what did you see that worked well?
Sure. All right. So for those who are unaware, Alex is referring to Proposition 209.
Right.
And I will share a quote of that proposition that took effect in 1998. And it's similar to what may happen at the federal level, but a bit more expansive. So Proposition 209 stated that the state of California, shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting. So much more expansive than admissions, which made it a challenge to live and work in that system for me for over a decade. But there was great success. I do want to speak to the impact of that because although we're located in Maryland and our risk is lower, we see across the various states in the United States that, and our colleagues who work elsewhere, that they have concerns. So what happened after this took effect in 1998 in California, and I worked there all the way till 2021, is that overall, and although the enrollment increased across all four-year institutions, enrollment rates fell for African Americans, for Latina, Latinx students, and Asian American students. So for those three groups, African American, Latinx, Asian American, and Alex, you listed some of the statistics there, but the annual enrollment for African Americans specifically declined by 15% post-Prop 209 and 10% for Latina and Latinx students in two systems, the UC system, which has 10 universities, and the CSU system, which has Sacramento State, San Francisco State, and so forth. And what we found is that the declines were disproportionately larger for African Americans and for Latinx students. So we saw that at Berkeley, you cited that already, their enrollment fell by half for Black students.
Yeah.
And they are still, just like San Diego, which is the campus I came from, recovering from that and working on a number of different steps. Did you want me to talk about strategies and at this time, or do you want Patricia to come back in?
Well, you can.
Sure.
You're
Okay.
on a roll. And by the way, I just want to say, you said 2021. It seems like you've been here a lot longer than that. So yeah.
Oh, really? Yeah, it's been 2 years.
Okay.
Okay. So some
And that,
things that,
so you're talking about strategies that we could employ or that they employed?
well, both, right?
Yes.
Because
Well,
they're best
interesting to hear.
practices for higher education. Yeah.
Right. Be interesting to
So
hear exactly what they did.
oh, okay. Yeah, sure. So some of the things that were done were working on and building pipeline programs with community colleges for undergraduate institution, for the undergraduate part of the institution, and then for undergraduate institutions and research institutes for the graduate and doctoral programs. And that included building out MOUs, memoranda of understanding with community colleges, with students of particular GPAs or interested in particular topics, and almost guaranteeing their admission to the UC system with certain criteria, right? And what we knew was that the majority of some of these community colleges had some of their populations that fell by enrollment in the UC system. That is Native, Latinx students, aka Hispanic students, at least by federal standards, and Black African American students. So those were the most underrepresented. And so targeting or working more closely with those community college students to either have dual enrollment related programs and or creating pathway programs were very helpful, pipeline programs. Another thing was actually building relationships with tribal communities and with Black communities and working with foundations that were committed to racial equity. And so although some public funds could not be used for either enrollment, pipeline, or partnership programs, there were foundations like the San Diego Foundation and other foundation and private donors who would then, in building relationships with them philanthropically, we were able to secure funding for students who wanted to study in STEM or do something related to research around pollution or environmental justice, immigration. Of course, we're a border city in San Diego. So either thinking about issues and people and working with partners who were able to fund students to do that. One of the biggest successes that the university had through the office that I was serving in, previous Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, was a grant from CZI, Chan Zuckerberg Institute, private corporate foundation, and we were able to secure $35 million for a PATH program, which is a STEM program for undergraduate students moving into STEM careers, and mostly thinking about volunteering or working in Facebook, Google's types of the world. So a lot of it had to do with targeted, private, as well as administrators developing relationships in the community.
Now, was that when California instituted the top 9% program?
That was one of the strategies as well, top 10, top 9%. Michigan has something quite similar. And so it is regardless of the school district or geographic area that you came from, if you were in the top 9 or top 10% of your school, your undergraduate institution or your community college, then you would, or high school, then you would be considered a part of that class, or at least given admission to the university. Of course, it's a more creative
some
and
institution
intricate process
in the system, right?
Exactly, right. So then it's not prejudiced, if you will, to a particular area. It is all the districts in a particular geographic region within a particular state in Michigan or California. And so that would be those that are under-resourced. It would be those with more racially minoritized groups or from certain socioeconomic backgrounds, but it would not be exclusive to any group, and it's a more inclusive process.
Okay. You know, you're bringing up the financial aspects. I want to ask Patricia about something that let me preface by saying that I mentioned in Michigan, and I should say it wasn't just Black enrollment that was impacted. Native American enrollment, for instance, was once as high as 1% at the University of Michigan. Now it's about 0.1%. So all groups there were impacted. But I do want to look at what Michigan has done. And one of the things they did, besides, they created advising corps for young alumni, recruiting office in Detroit, but they created a lot of financial incentives, generous scholarships. Are those things we can do, or are we impacted? We talked about this case at College Park. Do you want to, Tricia, tell us about the sort of the legal environment when it comes to these scholarships?
Oh, absolutely. And in 1994, the Fourth Circuit gave its final judgment on a case, Poderesky versus the University of Maryland College Park. University of Maryland College Park at the time had two merit scholarships, one the Benjamin Banneker and one the Francis Scott Key. The Benjamin Banneker Scholarship was exclusively for African American students. Poderesky was Hispanic, did not qualify for the Key, and wanted to know why he was not eligible for the Banneker Scholarship. And it was only because he was not an African American student. When that case was decided, and prior to that case, the state of Maryland had a fund called Other Race Grant. And if your campus had minority enrollment, those students, just because they were minority students, could be considered for that award. After Poderesky, any awards that were out there that were specifically race-based awards, schools could no longer have those type of awards, especially if the funding was state funding. And for most of the funding that we even have here at UMB, for example, our diversity funding was at that time, prior to 1994, exclusively for people of color. But what UMB was able to do, and I think this has something to do with our success in enrollment, UMB changed its policy and allowed each school to determine what is diversity for your particular school. And when I look at the students who are receiving these diversity funds, which in some of the schools, these funds are guaranteed all 4 years of enrollment or 3 years of enrollment, as long as you maintain academic progress and you're on track to graduate. So what we're seeing now, the use of these funds, we're seeing classrooms that look like West Baltimore, classrooms that look like the people that they will serve. And so again, since 1994, we have understood we can't have race-based awards, but we can use those awards to bring the results in admissions, in matriculation, and in graduation that we look to have.
Okay. So Diane, some of these measures that you were talking about, California, these race-neutral approaches, or that it didn't cross the line. Do we have some of those strategies in play here? Or are there things that you're thinking about, or what's the status?
So, just listening and working with Patricia and understanding more about what we do at UMB, I think a number of these things are already in play. And so what I'd like to do is share with the community listening what we are doing, what we intend to do. And some of these are best practices from California and Michigan, which include considering first generation low income status and experience. So FGLI students, first generation low income students, as well as geographic residency. So regional, like where students are
Can I just ask you about that really quickly? Because I read somewhere most first generation students and low income first generation students are white. So is that?
I don't think that's the case
No?
in some regions. And of course, I think state by state, it does matter.
Right, I'm sure that's
right.
different.
So certainly in California and Michigan, in California, the majority is the majority of the population is almost 40% Hispanic or Latino.
Okay.
And so that plus Black population is like 5%. In other words, actually a majority minoritized population elsewhere in the U.S. I think it is regional across the U.S. I would have to look at the statistics on that. Maybe that is nationally. In Maryland, we know what our statistics look like, which is those who identify as white, about half, about a third African-American, and then maybe 7 or 8% Asian, and about 10% Latinx, Hispanic, and so forth. So depending on, and Patricia can tell us, like at one point we talked about in our preparation, well, how do we do these admissions essays? Like what do we look for? So I hope we'll hear more about that in a bit. Another thing is to think about not just school districts, but the level of resources that school districts have and hardships that students overcome. So think giving special consideration, or also considering, not only, but also considering an applicant from an under-resourced school or a district that doesn't have, all the things that some other districts might have in some counties, like we know in this area, Montgomery County, Howard County, and others are better resourced than Washington, D.C. schools or Baltimore City schools, et cetera. The 10% top 10% plan, we had talked about that. Something that I referenced earlier, which is the development of pipeline programs and partnerships with school districts, with universities and colleges that serve underrepresented groups. And so these are partnerships with HBCUs, historically Black colleges or universities, partnerships with women's colleges, partnerships with tribal colleges, partnerships with universities that serve students from lower income backgrounds. I mean, there are multiple ways that we can think about this. And so as we develop those kinds of partnerships, it's an investment, I would say at least 3 to 5 years plus of meeting with administrators, advisors, understanding their curriculum, building relationships with those students. So from the moment they're in undergraduate, of course, I would say just like the CURE program, right? Building relationships from K through 8 and that timeline. So they can always know that our university exists. They can also always see professionals from different backgrounds and see themselves being a social worker or a physician or an attorney or, pharmacist by our interactions in the pipelines and relationships we build. Also enhancing, as we do with CURE, and we can certainly build other programs, enhancing mentoring and tutoring and retention efforts to students enrolled interested in particular issues or topics. And what I mean by that is, and this happened in COVID in the UC system, things related to health equity, environmental justice, economic disparities, health access, and so forth. So students or their groups or programs interested in those things, like, throughout the state, we have programs related to tech and robotics and that kind of thing. Well, they're probably going to be streamlined for working, I don't know, at Lockheed or at NIST or some researcher, because from ages of 8 through 12, there was this particular interest or program in that area. And so you will find that students who are interested in things related to health equity and economic disparities and justice and the law may be from particular backgrounds. If we go by issue and topic, we can also diversify our class as well as enrich the learning environment. And then finally, I mean, there's some others, but I do want to talk about this, and this is happening in admissions anyways, to increase flexibility in admissions criteria so that we de-emphasize test scores. Let me repeat that, de-emphasize test scores. Many of us on our university and other places in social work, in law, and other fields, in education, of course, higher education leadership, we study the impacts and the ineffectiveness of some of these scores in actually predicting performance in some areas. Now, I know in some disciplines this is really important, and without that, it's hard to measure proficiency in a particular area, but to de-emphasize them to the extent that we look at other areas of competence and other talent students are bringing, and also to de-emphasize legacy status. I don't think that's a big risk for us, but
hitting all the bases.
It's something to mention in higher education. And I mentioned legacy status because a recent study at Harvard showed that 43% of their white students are what they call ALDC students. And that is athletes, legacy as in their parents or relative attended, or they are related to the D is the donors or S staff. So, so they are related to one of these and are in this group. So 43% of white students are in any of those groups: athletes, donor, children of employees, or legacy. Whereas for Black, Latina, and Asian American students, they represent each less than 16% of that very category. So 16, 43, that's almost 3 times more.
Right.
White students are in the donor legacy group, whereas it's barely 15% for each of the other groups. So it does show the type of disadvantage when we say, okay, we're going to make legacy a very important group. But what the research has shown is that disadvantages underrepresented minoritized groups. And so it is less likely they're going to choose those schools, or those schools will choose them, we might also say. And that certainly in the admissions process, we need to de-emphasize that. So yeah, thinking about region, issue, income, and changing some of the traditional criteria to be more inclusive and equitable.
All right, we're going to bring in the audience in just a minute, so please write your questions. I only have one question in the chat so far. We can do better than that. So please write those questions now. But I want to ask you, you're talking about the legacies and all that. Patricia, is that something that we do? Is any school at UMB, are we?
So because admissions is decentralized, in the central registrar's office, we don't capture that information.
But you know things, you know how things work. Are you aware of any of that?
Not aware that it really impacts the admissions decision. I do know, because of my length of employment here, there are some students who were here in the 90s in the dental school, and I've seen their offspring here now in the dental school. So I don't want to say that that's why they got here, but I would like to say that because their parents had a great experience here at UMB, that's why they applied and that's why they were admitted.
Could be. I mean, world's first dental college. It's a pretty big draw. I don't know why you wouldn't want to come here.
As
Let me
well
bring
as
it.
clinical experience.
We have a lot more to talk about. Since we do have a question out there, I'm going to bring in Robin Crandall. Robin, what's your question? I'm trying to unmute you, but it doesn't.
I work in medicine and do faculty recruitment.
Yes.
Realize that this is more focused towards student enrollment stuff, but I am assuming that the Supreme Court decision will somehow trickle down to faculty recruitment, and just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that.
At the moment, we, depending on how narrowly everything is going to be worded, it may not. But your point is well taken, Robin, which is it will have an impact on the diversity, climate, and environment, if you will. So some of the same strategies in other institutions is what we would continue to employ here, which is we have these core values that we believe in, part of which is equity and justice. And we can certainly make the case, given our discussion earlier, that because of our health and human services commitment, where we live and work and research, and where our work is conducted in the populations that we treat, we also want a diverse class, which means having diverse faculty to teach, research, work, advise, and do the mentoring, and all those things are really important to have. And so it is about representation. It's also about enriching the research environment, but two, the student experience, which is improved when there's diverse faculty and there's a mentoring relationship that can be built, which we know, just like the patient, client, and provider relationship is strengthened when there's racial and gender diversity and other types of diversity. So yes, it's going to have an impact, I think, at least culturally speaking. I'll let the legal experts speak to some of the other pieces. UMB is committed to equity and to justice. We are committed to diverse teaching and learning environment. And so for accreditation, for who we say we are in terms of our mission, vision, and values, those things remain consistent.
Yeah, I just want to go back to one thing you mentioned. I'm glad you did HBCUs, because we have just in Maryland 4 great HBCUs, right? Bowie, Coppin, Morgan, UMES, and some of them have programs that are perfect to feed students. They have nursing program, pharmacy, social work, life sciences. I know the School of Social Work, for instance, is getting. I might be making news here because it hasn't been released yet, but I'll just say they've got a grant to have a project to draw students into social work from Coppin and UMBC and help fund their education in exchange for their participation in the workforce as mental health care workers in schools. So it's a great program. Now that's a very specific thing, but it seems like we ought to be able to do a lot more. I mean, within our own system, we ought to be able to do a lot more. How can we do that? Either one of you.
Go ahead, Patricia.
I would say, just like Diane said earlier, what happened in California. And I do know that the graduate school is doing things like that, creating pipelines. But we just need to have a conversation with the admissions people at these schools, or also with the departments in those schools, where we could create a feeder from this school to UMB. And relationship building does a lot of this. And when I say relationship building, it's not that we have to make a guarantee that the student would be admitted, but send us your best. So if you know that Coppin has a great Bachelor's of Social Work program, or Morgan, because when I think about Morgan, we're competing for their MSW students as well. So we would have to show that even though Morgan has that program, there's something unique about UMB.
Right.
That also includes marketing. So first, relationship building, and then marketing to show what we do well.
All right, let me bring in Lily Price with a question about something you mentioned, Patricia, a little while ago about grant program. Lily, are you there? Lily, I'm trying to unmute you. Go ahead.
Hey, sorry, the audio cut out just there. Sure. Yeah, I was wondering, what if affirmative action were to be overturned by the court, what the immediate effects on higher education in Maryland would be. And then also, Patricia, you mentioned something, I think about a grant program, if I heard that correctly, that then resulted in a classroom reflecting the demographics of West Baltimore. And I was just wondering if you could explain that a little further.
Great, thanks.
So in terms of the diversity award, schools are able to, in the admissions process, they're looking for students who are not only going to be the best in the classroom, but those who are going to bring something unique and students who will do well within the community. And in doing so, they are able to offer this award to students. And in some cases, that award is guaranteed all 3 or 4 years of enrollment. And when that happens and a student is trying to figure out how am I going to finance my higher education, to be able from a financial aid office standpoint to say to the student, especially if they are comparing awards, UMB has made this commitment to you. This is how much you're going to get in grant money. In the cases of if you have to borrow money, this is what your borrowing is going to look like. This is what loan debt is going to look like. And when students are kind of on the fence and they have this type of funding and they want to say to me, XYZ school has offered this, my first question is that award guaranteed? In some cases, it's not. If that award is not guaranteed, I say to them, go back to that school. How many people that they awarded that money to as an incoming student actually were able to keep that money years 2, 3, 4, however long the program is? And having those types of conversations, but also showing the commitment that UMB has to diversity, that gets that student to say, UMB is the place that I would like to be. Now, do we have enough money to fund everybody? Absolutely not. But for those who are eligible for those funds, it is a win-win for them because they don't have to worry about finances while they are here.
Great.
And in terms of the impact of the decision, based on what Patricia's explained and what we know we've been doing as a university, I don't feel very concerned about us specifically, because our admissions process, as we've been hearing, is holistic. We consider a number of elements and factors. Now, certainly there will be, and this is planned, programming and training and conversations with our admissions folks, because as Patricia has mentioned, it's decentralized to some degree, but we need to have a common understanding of our commitment to equity and justice, our commitment to diversity, and also that race is not the only thing we are considering here. And if we're not able to consider that there are all these other areas that we just talked about related to issue, region, background, experience, heritage, hardship, income, and I said income before, status in life, really, that we can also consider when you think about putting a class together.
Patricia mentioned relationship building, and it made me think, Diane, a lot of what your mission is focused on is building this diverse and inclusive environment at UMB. But then, to the extent that we're successful, how do we relate that? How do we get that word out that that we are successful and that this is a good place to be, right? This is a place you want to be. You maybe, I love Morgan. Morgan's fantastic, but maybe you shouldn't consider Morgan. Maybe you should consider UMB instead of. How do we get that word out to the world?
Well, one of the first things that we have to do is we're not just going to come up with our plan when the decision comes down, but continue to do what we're doing, which is communicate about our core values, the various things that we are doing. We can build on it based on our programs, our relationship with our community, our physical community, as well as other partners, corporate, nonprofit, faith-based partners. I think we can certainly improve and enhance our efforts and decide among us, what is that common messaging? We are moving into an era, I think the next 5 to 10 years, that will be more competitive as a result of this. Some people will not even apply to certain institutions because they're not going to, they may believe that they may not be welcome. And in fact, they may not be, because if they're going to be the only in a particular class, whatever that is, they're going to choose an environment where they think it is culturally or personally or in terms of their background, they're going to be welcome there, which is exactly what happened in parts of California. People just didn't choose the UC system anymore. Either they didn't choose it or the system didn't choose them. And then they chose institutions that were more diverse and where they thought that they could thrive and would not experience isolation and a hostile learning or teaching or work environment. So these are things we have to be thinking about as well, both internally and externally. What do we who do we want to be as an institution, and how do we want to communicate that messaging?
I have an anonymous question that may put you a little bit on the spot, Diane, but I know you can deal with it, so I'm not going to worry about it. And that is this person writes, is this the beginning of a campaign to ditch DEI programs at PWIs? And I guess that's primarily white institutions.
Predominantly white institutions.
Yeah. So is that
Is it the beginning of a campaign?
Are we
DEI
seeing?
programs?
And I'm reading into that.
Yeah.
And this is just me reading into it. It's not the question. That there's been a lot of talk out there about pushback against EDI programs at institutions. Is this going to feed into that? I guess is another way.
It is a part of a larger movement that we've noticed. And at the recent National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education meeting, the NADAHE meeting in April, we had extensive conversations, a 3-day meeting, most of which was focused on the current climate politically, socially, and historically. And it has already begun. I read an article earlier this week about the University of Arkansas. I hope I have the right institution that's eliminating their DEI division. And this is happening in other places as well, both either by law or the political environment in that state or nationally. And what is happening or beginning to happen is the resources and funding from those divisions are now going to go towards student access, retention, mentoring, faculty development in broad areas. Now, those are established divisions or portfolios, if you will, at universities like faculty affairs or student success. And the people in those divisions are then given the opportunity to be rehired or their talents to be repurposed in another area of the university. So wherever there's been or there have been state restrictions of any kind, what we're seeing is either an elimination or an integration of DEI related competencies and proficiencies in other areas of the university. And I think this may happen in certain areas, although there's some institutions that are building their areas in those ways. So it remains to be seen in the next 5 years what way the pendulum is going to swing.
All right, another anonymous comment. Someone writes that, and I guess this comes from, yes, it says, New York Times opinion writer Adam Grant wrote, academic grades rarely assess qualities like creativity, leadership, teamwork skills, or social, emotional, or political intelligence. Yes, straight A students master cramming information and regurgitating on exams, but career success is rarely about finding the right solution to a problem. It's more about finding the right problem to solve. That's kudos to Adam Grant. That's written very well. But so this person's asking, what should the admissions process be like? How should it evolve to reflect all those kinds of qualities? Because it doesn't sound like we've got a firm handle on exactly how to assess students that gets us the best student body overall.
So I would say the best student body is not necessarily that GPA or that test score, because that writer is correct. You can cram all night or you can be a good test taker, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be the best attorney or you're going to be the best pharmacist. When I worked in admissions, it was really a holistic approach. Before looking at someone's test score or grades, for me, it was their essay. Because can you write? Especially if it's in a program where writing is a heavy requirement. And how do you tell your story in what you write? Then, did you choose the right people to serve as recommenders for you? Did you go to people who really knew you? And did you go to possibly that teacher where you didn't get that A? Did you go to the teacher where you got a C? And they were able to tell the story. So wrapping all of that together and looking at how the class was going to flesh out. For me, that person who was able to tell their story, who had that recommender, who actually said they went from here to here, we saw progression. That's a good student for that admissions process, but also not just a good student for that admissions process. That's a student who, when given the offer of admission, that's the student who's going to accept that offer of admission. That's the student who's actually going to show up and enroll, but that is also the student who's going to become a part of the fiber of that institution. So again, yes, beyond grades, beyond test scores, admissions is doing and should continue to look at the entire application, picking out things that you don't pick up from grades or test scores.
But is there still a role in there for grades and test scores? I mean, it's some indicator,
Yeah.
something, right?
It is some indicator, but it should not be the sole indicator. So for example, when you get the admissions application, now when we have to report, because different schools have to report to their accrediting bodies, US News and World Report is still around. So no one wants to be in the second tier. Everyone wants to be in the first tier. So yes, grades and test scores would be important for those things. And in some cases, test scores could be an indicator of how a student is going to perform on future tests that they would have to take. So you want to look at those, but again, you don't want that to be the 100% focus, or you don't want to discount a student who is not at your median test scores or your median grades.
Dan, you look like you were going to add something there. I cut you off.
Oh, no, I was just nodding, saying absolutely.
Oh.
You know, I was thinking of something, thank you, Alex, of all the other characteristics that are needed in today's professions, particularly in the post-COVID world, such as, and there's a lot of writing now about generations and resilience, grit, compassion, care, the ethic of care, these kinds of things that, particularly since COVID and all that we've experienced, people need in their professions. And I gave a keynote for the LEAP Symposium, the Leaders in Education, Presidential Scholars, about teaching and learning. And we talked about the pedagogy of belonging. And I believe it was the School of Nursing and Social Work as well, where they teach courses related to resilience, compassion, and society, like in different ways. And people ask, well, how can you teach resilience? You know, especially given what's going on with medicine right now and physician burnout and so forth. So, you know, and we saw this in my previous institution in the UC system, you know, big STEM institution. You may have the MCAT scores and you may have gotten into the med school or the School of Public Health or pharmacy or one of those schools. But then once it's time to execute the job, what we find is even high performing students don't necessarily have the compassion, the resilience, or the care, or the things that are needed to take them the extra mile in the job. So those are really important too.
It's great that you mentioned the pedagogy of belonging. You know, people over in my office hear me say all the time that maybe the best thing we do, and we do a lot of things at the university, is the Cure Scholars Program, because you see the commitment of the parents, the kids, and the great talent, and it's amazing, and they can do anything. And one of the things that they teach, and I don't know if you've been to any of the graduation, I remember Rodney Taylor saying at the graduation ceremony that, you know, you belong here in the room, you belong here, and these kids, you can tell, believe that and are successful. You can't, I mean, not just for UMB's sake, but a program like that that's obviously successful, can't that be expanded? Can't we do more of that? Can't that be all around the state? Is that something that we can help foster because we've shown that it works?
Yeah, certainly. You know, all the things we said earlier about relationship building, and my own experience previously, and I'm just looking at institutions that thrive in these areas, are relationships with our various partners and donors, like really getting people excited about helping us expand these areas and or sponsoring a child, a program, building things out, helping, you know, students from, there are all kinds of models of helping students all the way from high school through to college. And there are programs where we also advocate for funding for their families. Because in many cases, when you're a first generation student, you are also a source of income from the age of 12 or 15 or 18. When you go off to college, we on the higher education side say, oh, great, look, they're going to college. And for the family is like, oh, great, we've lost a source of income. Right. And so in some of the models that I've seen, for example, the Chan Zuckerberg Institute fellowship and program before, it is also providing funding for that family for so-called loss of income that student would have. And so their living expenses paid for there and something related to the families. It's a more elaborate model, but this is part of what increases social and economic and academic mobility for students and their families, because it's a whole family experience when you're first generation, and for everyone really, but you know, they experience the losses in a sense, in a way that some of us are not able to understand. And so we have to think about access and equity in those terms as well, which is providing the economic benefit and advantage that these students who are first generation or low income or from under-resourced schools or districts do not have. Whereas for some of us, we've been able to pay for the college prep this and the SAT that and MCAT. And with that type of preparation, it provides students an advantage. And so what can we do then to economically even the playing?
Another anonymous question here is about pathway programs focusing. So what about pathway programs focusing on students who will serve in rural, tribal, or urban areas? I don't think we have any tribal areas here, but it reminds me of something. Last week, I attended an event on the Eastern Shore where the local health officials there unveiled the new mobile treatment unit treating people with opioid use disorder. And this is something that it's done in conjunction with our school of medicine. It's a fantastic program. What really struck me was how many people involved in the program were from that area. In fact, the guy that runs the truck grew up, he's 70 years old, he grew up in Caroline County. And so there is a natural, not for everyone, but for some people to want to go back to where they're from and serve in their neighborhood, in their community. So there may be some value to that, right? To pulling people out of some of these areas where they really need healthcare, social work, law, services, so forth, and with the hopes of maybe getting them back into those communities, wherever it is in the state. How can we do that?
Absolutely. Those programs do exist, and students thrive and have the motivation to not only study, grow, learn in those areas when they know they are going to contribute to areas from which they are from, such as the Imperial Valley in California. There's a program like that. UC Riverside has a medical school program that students are funded. After residency, they have to return to serve for 5 years in that area. And the Imperial Valley and that general area have the largest under-resourced communities who are both either Native, Indigenous, or Latine. And so students from that community with the grades and everything else can go to Riverside Med School with funding, but the agreement is 5 years. And so it's like your post-residency, you'll go back here. And of course, that's going to change the health trajectory and outcomes for that community for generations. So I think they're in their 8th or 9th class now, and it's having great success. And it is first increasing medical school entrance by changing the economic outcome for them and outlook, because a lot of these students don't have the funding to attend med school, and then they have the opportunity to serve after. So it's successful again once there's a funding related to that.
What are you both going to be focused on when these rulings come out, and what are you most concerned about?
So I want the ruling to be as narrow as possible. And as an optimistic person, that's what I'm laying my hat on.
Okay.
But knowing how things could work and knowing what UMB has put in place, I'm hoping that the state of Maryland would provide additional resources to all public institutions to make certain that we are able to create stronger pipeline programs, create pathway programs, similar to the one that Diane just spoke about. When she was speaking about that pipeline program, the state of Maryland does have a loan repayment program for persons who are going to serve in underserved areas. Why not make that a grant program? So if you enroll at UMB from an underserved area, the Eastern Shore, the Western Shore, let's provide that funding up front, in hopes that if that funding is provided upfront, then the student would return there to do their residency. So again, whatever comes down, I see that UMB is in a good position to weather that storm, but also hoping that the state would provide additional funding to all public institutions.
Diane?
Agreed. None of this happens, particularly in public institutions, by accident or coincidence. We have to be strategic in our planning and put our money where our mouth is. And so far as an institution, I think we have been doing that. And all that we've heard today about how we go about our admissions, we're in a good position. I say we continue to do that in terms of policy and practice. we will need to do more training and development so that we are all commonly understanding what we mean by our commitment to diversity and that we're practicing that in real time. And the second piece is committing the fiscal resources to increase access to students who do not have access along all the lines that we mentioned earlier. It does take strategic planning and intentional action. And for the programs that have worked in Michigan and California and in other places, we have some here. We can continue to build that. I love your idea, Alex, of the CURE program. We have so many other ways that we can increase and improve our partnerships with HBCUs. Like any other institution, we're going to be bought out of the market, if you will, because people are already, since 2016, enrollment in HBCUs and women's colleges, undergrad and in grad, have increased since 2016 and since 2020, and the racial reckoning and all that we experienced there. I have family members who are part of that, given options to go to NYU, Stanford, Columbia, Texas A&M, Howard University, and or another HBCU for the very reasons that we're talking about here. They don't want to feel like racial isolates, even though they have the grades and everything else. They're going to be the only. And people don't want to be in that kind of learning environment, particularly since 2020. So we have to think about things related to belonging and isolation and increased access for students who are disadvantaged in our or marginalized in our higher education systems.
Well, I like the optimism. You were talking about strategy, and it reminded me of something. One of you said in one of our meetings about the system. We're part of this great university system, and it seems like there ought to be a way to leverage that to our benefit. Is that under discussion? Have you been privy to any of those ideas?
Patricia, anything on admissions? I have a few things.
Nothing that I've been privy to.
Okay, so the Diversity Council at the system level, we have meetings, I think about once every other month, once a quarter or so, and we've discussed what the impact is and might be at the various institutions. And so we've been sharing updates on what we each have been doing. And I think there are potential collaborations. And of course, we're learning from each other's ideas. And so that's going to be certainly helpful. And I know the chancellor has requested information from all the areas on what have we been doing, have we formed any committees, are there practices or policies in place, and if so, what are they? And that was just the end of May to June. So I anticipate we're going to continue to work, and I think we need to work as a system to be more effective and impactful.
Yeah, they talk a lot about systemness at the system, which is great because it is a power to be part of a system. And one of the ideas I know that is out there is that, if you look at all the varied undergraduate institutions, you can study anything. We have a school for it, whatever it happens to be. But in our case, where those are feeder institutions for UMB, maybe the message could be that, this is a package deal. You don't have to leave Maryland to be a doctor or a lawyer or a social worker, right? So you can enroll right now in a program at any of our many USM institutions, and maybe there's a way to grease the wheels into UMB to become that professional, right? So I don't know, there could be some ideas there. It could be an exciting time for us. I mean, despite the challenges, this could spark a lot of creativity, I suppose.
Yeah, there's great opportunity. There's some of this that's a little disappointing, thinking about this decision, and it does feel like the erasure of important populations and experiences and identities.
Right.
And that part is like, oh, I can't believe it. As some people have described it, it feels to some people that we are moving backwards. And because if you look at the research, most Americans support it,
right,
want it expressed or executed in particular ways in higher education, but the majority of Americans, according to various polls, support affirmative action. They understand the need for it. However, we see where we are right now. I am optimistic because I do believe, especially at UMB and throughout the state of Maryland, we're in a good place. We are going to be challenged, though, with competition and increasing our efforts.
All right. Patricia, final word?
We're going to do well. We're going to do well. Things that have been on our bucket list, we're going to actually put them into action. And for me, I'm looking forward to maybe 6 years from now to see our first admitted student into one of our health professions program who will be able to say, I was a part of the Cura Scholars program.
Right. That would be fantastic.
Mhm.
My money's on, well, I'm not going to say her name, but I have a specific favorite from cohort 1 who I believe will be back here at our medical school. So we'll see. We'll see if I'm right. Thank you both for taking the time to do this. I know we're committed to stay on top of this topic. And in the President's Q&A, which is coming up at the end of the month on the 27th, I think, of the 24th. Don't trust me. Check the calendars. But the President's Q&A coming up is going to focus on this issue. We may have a decision by then, and also in student finance, which is another, student debt and debt forgiveness, and the status of that is another very big issue for our students. So we're gonna stay on top of this, and I do appreciate your taking the time again. Thank you to the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And have a good day.